Well, this is my closing arguments, remarks, and so forth. Um, Basically, what we've gotten from John is the totality, really, what his argument has been so far through this debate is simply um, we know that God doesn't absolutely control everything because people rebel against him. And that's why he continues to bring up passages like Jeremiah 32 and things of that nature. Now, of course, I've already addressed this, but as I stated before, what John has failed to do is to demonstrate that they were doing this freely. That is, that these people rebel freely, autonomously, apart from God and his decrees, his determination, his foreordination, whatever term you would like to use. He's failed to demonstrate this, whereas I, on the other hand, I pointed out that even people's rebellion is part of what God decrees. I used the example of Christ's crucifixion, where they were rebelling against God's law, his precepts, his commands to not murder, and they murdered him. It was part of his decree. I used Pharaoh as another example, where he says, Moses, you go to Pharaoh, you tell him to let my people go. That is the command. But I'm going to harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. Thus, the decree. And I really could go on and on with examples. I mean, there are so many examples in Scripture where people are violating, they are rebelling against God, but yet at the same time, we're told that God is the one sovereignly moving. We can think of Isaiah 10 with the Assyrians coming upon Israel as a judgment. What does God say? It says that the Assyrians did not purpose in their hearts, but God used them as the text says, the rod of his anger. So much so that he describes the Assyrians as a man yielding a club or a man yielding an axe. That he has that much control, God being the man in that metaphor, the axe being Assyria. There are so many examples where we are told in the context that people are rebelling against God, but God in fact was decreeing their rebellion against him. And this is where John has failed. He just keeps assuming that every time you see rebellion, well, God's not in control. But again, he hasn't dealt with my arguments. He has not addressed what I've presented here with these. Maybe he will in his closing remarks. I do not know. But he has failed to do so. The fact remains is that it is God's will, and he sovereignly brings about the disobedience and the rebellion of man. This is seen throughout all of Scripture. But for some reason, the non-reformed folk just will not acknowledge this. Now, I know why they won't acknowledge it. I mean, ultimately, it's the sovereignty of God, but there's the immediate causes and reasons for it as well. But that's been the base of his argument. Rebellion equals God's will isn't being done, and he's therefore not in control of everything. I've addressed this. It's clear what Scripture states regarding this issue. Likewise, I presented such texts like Psalm 147:8, 148:8, Psalm 89:9, Isaiah 51:15, where it says that God is the one who controls the clouds. He brings the clouds, he brings the rain, he brings the hail, the fire. The stormy wind is fulfilling his word. The seas, when they rise up, he calms them. When they're calm, he causes them to roar. So forth and so on. These are what we would call nature, things of nature. He hasn't addressed any of this. Now, these texts are not just telling us, well, every once in a while God will tinker with the weather, or he'll shoot a lightning bolt out every once in a while. But all the other times all of these things take place, it's just nature. That's not what these texts are telling us. These texts are descriptions of God controlling his universe, controlling his creation. That's what these texts are for. That's what they are presenting to us. But unfortunately, the Arminians, the non-reformed folk, so forth and so on, they won't address this stuff because simply put, they can't address this. They don't like the idea that God controls all of these things. Why? Because people die from lightning strikes. People die from tsunamis. People die from earthquakes. And so they say, no, God has to have hands off. He can't touch these things. And if he does, he can only do it as long as no one is hurt or affected by them. That's not what the text says. Okay, so John hasn't dealt with these passages. He hasn't addressed them in any fashion whatsoever. Likewise, more specific to the will of man, I brought up Acts 17, where it says, "He made from one man every nation of mankind to live in all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their habitation. In him we live and move and exist." That's absolute sovereignty. He determines when you're born, where you'll live. That's absolute sovereignty. But I thought it was my choice. I thought it was my parents' choice to have me be born at this hospital as opposed to that hospital. I thought it was my choice to live in this city. No. Ultimately, no. Did you choose it? Yes. But ultimately, you chose it because God determined it to be so. Philippians 2:13, "For it is God who is at work in you both to will and to do for his good pleasure." Proverbs 21:1, "The king's heart is like channels of water in the hands of the Lord. He turns it wherever he wishes." Is this just some kings? One king? 5 kings? Just Pharaoh? It's all kings. The text isn't being limited or specific to any king in particular. It's all kings. All kings' hand or hearts are in the hands of the Lord. He directs them wherever he wishes. That's why we can turn to Romans 13. And what does it say? All governments are established by God. But wait a minute, I thought we voted for Barack Obama. Well, I didn't, but I thought we voted for Barack Obama. All authorities are established by God. Romans 13. And again, James, you who say you're going to go to this city, that city, and perform business there. No, if the Lord wills, you will go to this city or that city and do this or that. It's the Lord's will. Okay? Now, even things, what we perceive as being random or chance driven and so forth, Scripture addresses this as well. Proverbs 16:33, "The lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord." Now the apostles knew this truth well when they cast lots to replace Judas in Acts 1:24 through 26. And they prayed and said, "You, Lord, who know the hearts of all men, show which one of these two you have chosen to occupy the ministry and apostleship from which Judas turned aside to go to his own place." And they drew lots for them. And the lot fell to Matthias, and he was added to the 11 apostles. You see, the apostles, the people of those days, understood what the Arminians, the Pelagians, the non-reformed folks don't understand today, is that God controls all things, even the casting of lots, even what we perceive as randomness. God controls it. Its every decision is of the Lord. Now, if someone wants to make a remark where it says, "which Judas turned aside to go to his own place," see, free will. Read Luke 22:22. Where it says that he did what was destined to take place. And again, Paul knew this idea of God's sovereignty very well. Acts 18:20-21, when they asked him to stay for a longer time, he did not consent, but taking leave of them and saying, "I will return to you if God wills." Romans 1:9 and 10, "For God, whom I serve in my spirit in the preaching of the gospel of his Son, is my witness as to how unceasingly I make mention of you, always in my prayers making request, if perhaps now at last by the will of God I may succeed in coming to you." 1 Corinthians 4:19, "But I will come to you soon if the Lord wills." You see, they understood that things only take place if it's God's sovereign will. Everything, just going to a particular city and doing business, just going to a particular church and giving them another letter or preaching to them, if the Lord wills. That they understood this. Today's church, the visible church today, does not grasp this concept whatsoever, because God has to be hands off. You got to be hands off on everything, but especially of my will. You can't do it. No, if the Lord wills. That's what Scripture says. Is it just sometimes? If the Lord wills in this particular case. But all the other cases, it's free will, not his will. No, if the Lord wills, in every circumstance. Now let's consider the timing of Christ's death. Was that just an accident? Was it chance that he was crucified when he was? John 7:30. So they were seeking to seize him, and no man laid his hands on him because his hour had not yet come. John 8:20. These words he spoke in the treasury as he taught in the temple, and no one seized him because his hour had not yet come. Mark 14:41. And he came a third time and said to them, Are you still sleeping and resting? It is enough. The hour has come. Behold, the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. There was an appointed time of Christ's death. Job 14:5. The days and months of your life have been determined. Again, another text that John did not address. Christ had an appointed time of death. Nothing could have changed that. That's why he said, my hour has not come. There is nothing, come hell or high water, that is going to cause me to not die when I have been appointed to die. How many things would God need to control in order for Christ to die at the appointed time? Think about it. How many things? The place of his birth, when he was born, the weather, everything. The very wills of the people that wanted to kill him. He had to control it. Now let's turn our attention back to the scriptures, which described God's active and absolute control over the elements and the animals and so forth. Now we must understand the context in which these people wrote in which they lived and wrote Scripture. When the authors of Scripture wrote concerning God's sovereignty, they wrote in light of their own immediate experiences and understandings of the world around them. In other words, given the fact that these folks did not live during a time of scientific enlightenment as we do, they used the common things which were familiar with them at that time. They spoke of God's control over the animals, the fish. They spoke of God's control over the elements such as wind, rain, lightning, waves, and so forth. They even pointed out things, as I previously addressed, things that seem to be random and chance-driven are the product of God's sovereignty, the casting of lots. However, if they had been around today, there's no question that they would have used things familiar to us, to our experience, our scientific experience. Instead of rain, maybe they would have spoken about H2O, the molecules, and explained how they work together, and that's God's sovereign control. Instead of simply using the example of a sparrow not falling from the sky, lest it be by the Father's hand, maybe they would have spoken about God's sovereignty over gravity. Okay? Instead of speaking about giving lions their food in due season, maybe they would have spoken about bacteria. Instead of casting lots, maybe we would have heard about the roll of the dice. Instead of the universe wearing out like a garment, maybe they would have spoken about entropy. The point is, they would have spoken in our modern lingo and terminology and understanding. But you see, today's Christian is a product of his environment. We live in a day in which science rules. Science gives us the answers of all of life's mysteries, so they say. This is where the idea of natural law comes into play. Scientists speak of gravity and thermodynamics. They speak of positive and negative ions mixing together and creating lightning or chocolate causing emotional fluctuations and so forth. This is all in an attempt to get rid of God. If man can come up with natural explanations for the hows and whys of the universe, then there is no need for the supernatural. And I'm sorry to say, but the visible church today is swallowing this hook, line, and sinker. The only difference between the Arminian and the non-Reformed folk is the issue of origins. Both the atheists and the Arminian walk hand in hand as they strive to give natural explanations to the workings of the universe. And they only part ways when it comes to the origins. The atheist comes up with is consistent and tries to explain the origins naturally, while the Arminian non-Reformed folk become very inconsistent and try to give a supernatural explanation. Now, this is precisely why folks like Dr. Morey says that Arminianism is only a bus stop away from atheism, or why R.C. Sproul says if we reject divine sovereignty, then we must embrace atheism. I leave with this, Ephesians 1:11. Also, we having obtained an inheritance, having been predestined according to his purpose, who works all things after the counsel of his will. Peace.